Picture the world around 2300 BC. In Britain, the massive stones of Stonehenge have already been standing for centuries, but something is about to change in how people build. Thousands of miles away in Malta, temples that had stood for over 1,000 years, structures older than the pyramids, are being abandoned. In Iberia, massive fortified settlements are being reworked, reshaped, sometimes torn down. And in Egypt, the age of building colossal pyramids is entering a period of crisis that some scholars connect to the very same window of time. Here's the question that should stop you in your tracks. How is it possible that cultures separated by mountains, deserts, and entire seas, cultures that almost certainly had no direct contact with each other, appear to hit a turning point in monument building at roughly the same moment in history? We're talking about societies on different continents, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, using different tools. Yet when archaeologists plot their timelines side by side, something strange happens. The lines seem to converge right around 2300 BC. Now, before you start imagining ancient aliens or a lost global civilization, let's slow down, because this is exactly the kind of pattern that demands real scrutiny, not wild speculation. There are basically three possibilities here, and only one of them is boring. Maybe there really was some kind of global event, a climate shift, a shared catastrophe, something that hit multiple regions at once and forced people everywhere to change how they lived and built. Or maybe these cultures were more connected than we think, trading ideas and technologies along routes we haven't fully mapped yet. Or, and this is the possibility serious historians take most seriously, maybe modern archaeology has accidentally created a pattern that never really existed. Dating techniques have margins of error. Chronologies get revised. Sometimes when you round enough centuries in enough different directions, coincidences start looking like conspiracies. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to walk through the evidence region by region. We'll look at the archaeology, the pottery styles, the burial practices, the layers of ash and silt that tell us when things changed. We'll look at environmental data, ice cores, and sediment records that hint at drought and climate stress. We'll compare radiocarbon dates that are precise against dates that are, honestly, educated guesses dressed up in scientific language. And we'll ask the hard question throughout. Is this a genuine historical mystery, or is it a mystery we built ourselves out of convenient timelines and modern storytelling? Before we go further, I want to know something. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? I love seeing these comments roll in. Last time I asked, I had someone listening at sunrise in Cape Town, and someone else falling asleep to this in Vancouver at the exact same moment. It's a strange kind of connection, isn't it? Thousands of miles apart, tuned into the same story at the same time. Kind of fitting, given what we're about to explore. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into history's genuine puzzles, the best way to support this channel costs you nothing. Just follow the show on Spotify, and if you've got a spare 30 seconds, leave a 5-star review. The link is right there in the description. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and it lets me keep making these long, detailed investigations instead of shallow clickbait nonsense. Alright, let's get into it. Because to understand whether 2300 BC really was some kind of turning point, we first need to understand what we even mean when we say megalithic culture. It's a term that gets thrown around loosely, lumping together societies that might have had almost nothing in common except a shared talent for moving very, very large rocks. And that distinction matters more than you might think. Let's start with the word itself, because megalithic sounds like it should mean something precise, something scientific, something that points to a specific group of people who shared beliefs, technology, and maybe even blood. It doesn't. The word simply means made of large stones. That's it. Mega, large, lithic stone. That's the entire definition. It says absolutely nothing about who built these structures, why they built them, or whether the builders in one region ever knew the builders in another region existed. Think about how strange that is for a second. Imagine if we grouped every culture that ever built with wood into one single civilization. Log cabins in Scandinavia, wooden temples in Japan, timber palisades in North America, all lumped together as the wood people, as if using a common material automatically means shared identity, shared religion, shared history. Nobody would take that seriously. Yet somehow, when it comes to giant stones, we've developed this habit of talking about megalithic culture as if it were one thing, one movement, one people, with a single blueprint spreading across the ancient world. It wasn't. It was a building tradition, a technique, a solution to a problem that dozens of unrelated societies arrived at independently, using the materials they had available and the tools their environment allowed. And once you start actually looking at what falls under this umbrella term, the differences become almost more interesting than the similarities. In Britain and Ireland, we're mostly talking about stone circles and passage tombs, structures like Newgrange or the rings at Avebury, built by farming communities, using primarily earthworks and standing stones arranged with careful attention to astronomical alignments. In Malta, the tradition looks completely different. Instead of open circles, you get enclosed temple complexes, curved chambers, elaborate carved stonework, structures that feel almost architectural in a way that British monuments simply don't. In Iberia, southern France, and parts of the Mediterranean, you often find massive fortified settlements with defensive walls built from enormous stone blocks, structures built for protection as much as ceremony. And then in places like Egypt and Mesopotamia, when people casually toss around comparisons to megalithic building, they're usually talking about something else entirely: dressed limestone, cut and fitted with extraordinary precision, organized under centralized state power, built for pharaohs and gods in a completely different social and political context than a farming village in Ireland raising a stone circle. So right away we have tombs, temples, alignments, ceremonial platforms, defensive walls, and monumental state architecture, all getting swept under one convenient label. These aren't variations on a single theme. They're different responses to different needs, built by different societies, organized in fundamentally different ways. Now, here's where it gets tempting to jump to conclusions. When you see two monuments on opposite sides of the world that look vaguely similar, standing stones arranged in a circle, say, it's incredibly easy to think someone must have told someone else how to do this. Ancient contact, lost civilizations, secret knowledge passed hand to hand across oceans. It's a great story, it's just usually not a supported one. Here's why. Humans, no matter where they live, are working with the same basic physics. Stone is heavy. Stone is durable. Stone lasts for thousands of years in a way that wood, bone, and cloth simply don't. If you want to build something that will outlast your own lifetime, something that marks a burial, honours an ancestor, or announces to your neighbours that your community can organise enough labour to move 20-ton blocks, stone is often the obvious answer. Whether you live in Wiltshire or the Maltese archipelago or the highlands of Peru. Independent invention isn't some exotic possibility. It's actually the expected outcome when different groups face similar practical and social problems using the materials nature happened to give them. Convergent solutions don't require contact, they require comparable needs. But even setting aside the question of contact, there's a second problem that's just as important, and it's one that gets glossed over constantly in documentaries and pop history. Timing. When people say megalithic cultures were building at the same time, what does that actually mean? Because these traditions weren't built in a single decade or even a single century. Some of these building phases stretched across 500 years. Some stretched across 1,000. Newgrange in Ireland was built starting around 3200 BC. The temples on Malta were being constructed and expanded from roughly 3600 BC all the way through to around 2500 BC. Stonehenge itself wasn't one construction event. It was multiple phases spread across more than 1500 years, with stones added, removed, and rearranged as generations came and went. So when you hear a claim like all megalithic cultures stopped building around 2300 BC, the very first question you have to ask is, stopped compared to what starting point? If one tradition ran for centuries before, quietly fading, and another tradition was still in full swing at that same moment, lumping them together as part of one synchronized ending is already misleading, before we've even looked at a single piece of evidence. This is why, before we can honestly evaluate whether 2300 BC really was some kind of turning point, we need standards. Real standards, not vibes. We need dates that come from solid radiocarbon evidence, not folklore or 19th century guesswork. We need to separate the moment a monument was originally built from the moment it was expanded, modified or abandoned, because those are very different events. And we need to resist the urge to treat every large stone structure on Earth as evidence for the same phenomenon, just because they're all impressively heavy. With that groundwork laid, we can finally start asking the real question. Not whether ancient people everywhere loved stacking rocks, but whether the actual dates, the ones archaeologists have painstakingly worked out region by region, genuinely cluster around this one suspicious point in time. And that search starts with figuring out why 2300 BC, of all years, keeps showing up in the conversation at all. The first thing to understand is that 2300 BC is not really a date in the way most people imagine a date. It sounds exact. It sounds like a switch flipped somewhere in the ancient world. 1 year people were raising stones, extending tombs, building temples, hauling blocks across landscapes. Then the calendar rolled over, something happened, and everybody stopped. But archaeology almost never works like that. Nobody from prehistoric Britain wrote down the final stone was raised in the year 2300 BC. Nobody on Malta stamped a temple wall with a date saying, "Construction ended here, on this day, because of this catastrophe." These societies mostly did not leave us calendars that can be converted neatly into our own. What they left us stones, bones, charcoal, pottery fragments, pollen grains, animal remains, burial deposits and layers of earth. Archaeologists take those traces and try to turn them into time. And that process is powerful, but it is not a stopwatch. Take radiocarbon dating, the tool behind many of the dates you see in documentaries. Living things absorb carbon while they are alive. When they die, one radioactive form of carbon begins decaying at a predictable rate. Measure how much remains in a piece of charcoal, a seed, a bone, or a wooden post, and you can estimate when that organism died. Sounds simple, except the result is not usually a single year. It is a range. A sample might tell us there is a high probability that a fire burned sometime between 2470 and 2290 BC. Another might suggest a burial happened between 2350 and 2140 BC. Those are not failures. That is what honest ancient dating looks like. We are working with probabilities, calibration curves, contamination risks, old wood problems and materials that may not date the event we actually care about. Think about that last one, because it matters enormously. Suppose you find charcoal under a stone monument. What have you dated? Maybe you have dated the fire from a ritual held before the stone was raised. Maybe you have dated wood burned by the builders. Maybe it is charcoal from a campfire made there 200 years earlier. Or suppose a burial is found inside a chamber tomb. That tells you someone used the tomb at that moment. It does not necessarily tell you when the tomb itself was built. A monument can remain important for centuries. People can return to it, bury their dead there, add offerings, rebuild entrances, or change its meaning long after the original builders are gone. So when somebody says a monument dates to 2300 BC, the real question is, what exactly dates to 2300 BC? The first construction? A later renovation? The final burial? The last feast held outside? The moment the site was abandoned? Those are completely different things, but in a simplified timeline they can all collapse into one little label. And that is how a broad, messy transition begins to look like a synchronized ending. There is another layer to the problem. Archaeologists do not only use calendar dates, they also use phases. You will hear terms like late Neolithic, Chalcolithic, early Bronze Age, Beaker period, or early dynastic period. These are useful labels. They help organize thousands of sites, objects and dates into patterns. But they are not universal chapters in a single global history book. The early Bronze Age did not begin everywhere on the same Tuesday. In Britain, a shift toward metal objects, new burial customs and beaker pottery may be used to mark one kind of transition. In Iberia, the chronology has its own regional sequence, its own settlement histories, its own local variations. Malta has another sequence entirely. Egypt had dynasties with written king lists and administrative records. Mesopotamia had city-states, empires, and named rulers. The Indus region followed yet another trajectory. Putting all of these places under labels that sound similar can create an illusion that they were all moving in lockstep. They weren't. A cultural phase is more like a weather map than a border on a modern atlas. It shows a pattern, but the edges are fuzzy. One community might adopt new metal tools early. Another keeps older practices for generations. One tomb tradition continues after nearby settlements have changed. One region experiences decline while another is expanding. There is overlap everywhere, and older publications often made this look cleaner than it really was. Especially in the early and middle decades of 20th century archaeology, chronologies were sometimes built from pottery styles and monument types before large numbers of radiocarbon dates were available. Researchers would arrange artifacts into sequences, then assign broad historical dates to those sequences. It was necessary work. It created the foundations archaeology still builds on. But it also encouraged a certain kind of neatness. A pottery style appears. Then it disappears. A tomb type becomes common. Then it falls out of use. A settlement layer ends. Then a new one begins. Put enough of those charts side by side round the dates to the nearest century, and suddenly you get a dramatic picture. Megalithic tombs end around 2500 BC. Temple building declines around 2400 BC. Fortified settlements change around 2300 BC. Urban systems face stress around 2200 BC. Before long, the differences blur together. 2 or 3 centuries become at the same time. A regional change becomes a worldwide event, and 2300 BC starts to look suspicious. Now, that does not mean the date is meaningless. Far from it. The centuries around 2300 BC really do sit near a major period of change across several parts of Europe and the Mediterranean. In some regions, older monumental traditions were changing or losing importance. In others, new burial customs, new metal technologies, new trade patterns, or new forms of social hierarchy were appearing. Some settlements were being abandoned, some fortifications were being built or intensified. Some long-established systems were under pressure. Then, just after this window, comes one of the most discussed climate episodes in ancient history, the so-called 4.2 kiloyear event. The name sounds technical because it is. It refers to evidence for a period of climatic disruption roughly 4,200 years before present, often placed around 2200 BC, though the timing and severity varied by region and by the record being examined. In some areas, climate archives suggest drier conditions. Lake levels changed. Cave deposits recorded shifts in rainfall. River systems became less predictable. Drought appears to have affected parts of the Near East, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean. This period has been linked, sometimes cautiously, and sometimes far too confidently, to political collapse in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt. But even here we need to slow down. The 4.2 kiloyear event was not one giant drought cloud that appeared over the entire planet on a single morning. Climate systems do not work that way. Different regions experience different effects. Some may have become drier, others may have seen changes in seasonality, stronger storms, altered river flooding, or no clear crisis at all. And even where drought occurred, human outcomes depended on local conditions. A farming community with diverse crops, storage systems, trade partners, and access to water might adapt. Another, already under stress from conflict, inequality, disease, soil exhaustion, or political instability, might not. Climate can create pressure. It does not automatically write the ending. Still, the coincidence is worth investigating. If several societies show signs of transformation within a few centuries of one another, and if climate evidence points to widespread environmental instability in roughly the same broad period, then 2300 BC becomes more than just a number people repeat online. It becomes a window, a place to look harder, not an exact cut-off, not a proven global catastrophe, a window. Maybe the real story is not that every megalithic culture stopped building at once. Maybe some traditions had already faded centuries earlier. Maybe others continued well after 2300 BC, but changed their purpose, scale, or style. Maybe people stopped building communal tombs, not because they vanished, but because new elites preferred individual burials. Maybe old ceremonial centres lost power as trade routes shifted, and metal became more important. Maybe some monuments were abandoned, while others became even more sacred, precisely because the world around them was changing. That is the danger of a single date. It turns a long human process into a magic number. Imagine trying to explain the transformation of the modern world by saying, everything changed in 2008. You could point to a financial crisis, political aftershocks, collapsing industries, shifting technology, migration, and changing trust in institutions. And you would not be wrong to call 2008 important. But you would be wrong to pretend all those changes began that year, happened everywhere equally, or ended on schedule. Some were already underway, others took decades to unfold. Some places barely felt the effects, others were transformed. 2300 BC may be that kind of date. A point where separate timelines seemed to draw close together. A period when old systems in several regions were becoming vulnerable, when environmental change may have added new pressure, and when archaeological chronologies, especially older simplified ones, can make the whole thing look more simultaneous than it was. So from here on, we have to keep two ideas in our heads at once. First, there may be a real pattern around the late 3rd millennium BC. Something was changing across a wide part of the ancient world. Second, the pattern is not automatically proof of one cause, one network, one disaster, or one moment when the stones fell silent. The only way to find out is to go region by region, monument by monument, and ask a much harder question than, did they stop around 2300 BC? We have to ask what was happening before it, what continued after it, and whether the silence in stone was really silence at all. Start with Atlantic Europe, because this is where the idea of a megalithic civilization feels most convincing. From southern Iberia to Brittany, across the Irish Sea and into Britain, people raised stones on a scale that still seems almost unreasonable. They built tombs from blocks weighing tonnes. They dragged capstones across uneven ground. They carved chambers into hillsides. They set lines of standing stones across open moorland. They turned entire landscapes into places where the living could meet the dead, remember ancestors, mark territory, exchange goods, hold ceremonies, and perhaps negotiate who belonged where. And they had been doing versions of this for a very long time before 2300 BC. That matters, because if we want to know whether something suddenly stopped in the late 3rd millennium BC, we first need to understand what had existed before it. Not one culture, not one people, not one architectural tradition spreading unchanged from coast to coast. Atlantic Europe was a patchwork of communities, each with its own monuments, local materials, burial practices, farming systems, and ideas about the past. They were connected, but connected is not the same as united. The megalithic tradition in this region reaches back into the Neolithic thousands of years before the supposed turning point. Farming had spread westward into Europe in stages, mixing with local hunter-gatherer populations and adapting to radically different environments. River valleys, coastal plains, uplands, islands, forests and boglands all shaped how communities lived. As people settled more permanently, cleared land, raised livestock, and cultivated crops, they also began building structures that outlasted any individual life. The most famous were communal tombs in Iberia, Brittany, Ireland, Britain, and Atlantic France. Archaeologists have found chambered tombs, dolmens, passage graves, gallery graves, court tombs, portal tombs, long barrows, and cairns. The names are modern categories, attempts to sort an enormous variety of ancient structures, but behind all of them is a basic and powerful idea. The dead were not always buried alone, in private graves, separated from everyone who came before. In many places, bones were brought together. Bodies might decompose elsewhere first. Selected remains could be placed into chambers over generations. A tomb could become the resting place of many people, used, reopened, altered, and remembered for centuries. These were houses for the dead, but they may also have been something more. A communal tomb could tell a farming community, "This land has ancestors. Our people have been here. We know this valley, we know these fields. We know where the cattle graze, where the water runs, where the sun rises at a particular season, and where our dead are kept." In a world without written land deeds, a monument built from stone could be a claim made visible, not necessarily a claim in the modern legal sense. Prehistoric people did not need to think like modern property lawyers to understand that ancestry, place, and belonging were connected. If your grandparents and their grandparents were buried beneath a mound on the ridge, that ridge meant something. If the route to the tomb crossed fields cleared by your community, those fields meant something too. And the labour itself mattered. Building a chambered tomb required planning. Stone had to be chosen, moved, shaped, and fitted. Earth had to be piled into mounds. Timber structures may have been used during construction. Food had to be produced for workers. Different households may have contributed labour, animals, tools, and ritual knowledge. A monument was not just the final arrangement of stones. It was a social event, a project that brought people together and made cooperation visible. That is one reason the phrase megalithic culture can be misleading. It makes the monument sound like a single package, as if everyone from Portugal to Orkney was following the same blueprint. They were not. In Brittany, enormous passage graves and cairns appeared in a landscape already dense with Neolithic activity. Some monuments, like the Great Mound at Barnines, were built and expanded over long periods, with multiple chambers incorporated into one massive structure. Karnak became famous for its extraordinary alignments, rows upon rows of standing stones stretching across the landscape. We do not know exactly what every alignment meant. They may have guided movement, marked ceremonial spaces, structured gatherings, or connected communities to particular features of the land and sky. But whatever their purpose, they show a society investing enormous effort in places meant to be seen. Across the Channel, southern Britain developed its own monumental vocabulary. Long barrows held collective burials. Causewayed enclosures, with their interrupted ditches and banks, may have served as gathering places, seasonal meeting grounds, ritual centres, or locations for feasting and exchange. Later came great henges, stone circles, and timber circles. These were not simply graves. They were spaces for the living, places where communities could gather in numbers far beyond an ordinary village. Ireland was equally varied. Court tombs, wedge tombs, portal tombs, passage graves, and stone circles appeared in different regions and different periods. At places like Brúna Bóinne, massive passage tombs were positioned and engineered with extraordinary care. At Newgrange, winter solstice sunlight reaches deep into the chamber for a brief moment each year. That does not mean we can reconstruct every belief attached to the site, but it does mean its builders understood the seasonal sky well enough to make the monument participate in it. In Iberia, the story was different again. There were dolmens and passage graves, but also distinctive tholos tombs, with round chambers and long corridors, especially in parts of southern Iberia. Some regions saw large ceremonial complexes, densely occupied landscapes, and later fortified settlements. The local histories were complicated: coastal exchange, access to stone and metal, changing settlement patterns, and contact with communities beyond Iberia all mattered. There was never one Iberian response to social change, because there was never one Iberian society. Atlantic France sat within these overlapping worlds. Communities along the coasts and river systems could exchange materials, skills, and ideas with Brittany, the British Isles, and Iberia. Certain monument forms and objects travelled astonishing distances. Polished stone axes made from particular alpine rocks, for example, moved far from their sources and became objects of status or ritual value. But shared objects do not prove a centralised authority directing construction across Europe. They show relationships, roots, repeated contact. People learning from one another, sometimes copying, sometimes adapting, sometimes doing something entirely local. And that diversity is already visible long before the late 3rd millennium BC. Some regions continued building or reusing tombs for generations. Others shifted emphasis from tombs to circles, enclosures, settlement sites, or new ceremonial places. Some monuments were enlarged. Others were deliberately closed, blocked, or transformed. A tomb that seems abandoned may have remained a place of memory. A stone circle that stopped receiving deposits may still have shaped how people moved through the landscape. Silence in the archaeological record does not always mean silence in human life. Even the basic relationship between monuments and farming was not identical everywhere. In some places, the expansion of agriculture appears closely tied to the rise of communal burial monuments. Settled communities had stronger reasons to invest in particular territories and to create durable ancestral landmarks. But farming itself was never stable. Soil could be exhausted. Forests could be cleared too aggressively. Herding strategies could change. Coastal resources might become more or less important. Population could rise, fragment, or move. A monument tradition had to survive inside all of those pressures. So by the time we approach 2300 BC, Atlantic Europe is not a single civilization waiting to collapse. It is a network of regional traditions with deep histories behind them. Some were already old, some had already changed beyond recognition, some were still active, some were being reused rather than newly built. And in several places, new ways of organizing society were beginning to compete with the old communal logic written into the tombs. That is the crucial tension. For centuries, the great monuments had emphasized collective ancestry. Many bodies shared chambers, landscapes made sacred through repetition. But toward the end of the 3rd millennium BC, in parts of Atlantic Europe, burial practices, trade networks, technologies, and displays of status began shifting. Metal became more important. New objects appeared. Individual graves could carry a different message from an ancestral tomb shared by generations. The stones had not all fallen silent, but the world that had made certain kinds of stone monuments meaningful was beginning to change. In Britain and Ireland, this tension is impossible to miss. Because this is the landscape of Stonehenge, Newgrange, Avebury, Maeshowe, the Ring of Brodgar, hundreds of passage tombs, henges, circles, cairns, and standing stones. If megalithic building really stopped everywhere around 2300 BC, surely this should be the easiest place to see it. But it isn't. In fact, Britain gives us one of the clearest reasons to be suspicious of the claim. Around the very period when the supposed silence begins, Stonehenge was still becoming Stonehenge. The site had already existed for centuries. Its earliest major earthwork, the circular ditch and bank, was built around 3000 BC. People buried cremated remains there. They returned to the place repeatedly. Timber posts were raised, the landscape around it filled with monuments, pathways, pits, burial mounds, and ceremonial spaces. Stonehenge was never one building project completed in one heroic moment. It was a place people kept remaking. Then, around 2500 BC, came the phase everyone recognizes. The enormous sarsen stones were brought to Salisbury Plain, shaped with extraordinary care, and raised into the great circle and horseshoe arrangement. These were not rough blocks dropped into the ground. Their builders worked the stone with joints that resemble woodworking techniques. Upright pillars were fitted with horizontal lintels. Some of the lintels were curved, so the circle would look continuous. The stones were carefully positioned in relation to the monument's central axis and the movements of the sun, and construction did not necessarily end there. The smaller blue stones brought from Western Wales over an immense distance were moved and rearranged in several phases. Dating the exact sequence is difficult. Archaeological dates come with ranges, and not every stone movement leaves a clean timestamp behind. But the broad picture is clear enough. Major activity at Stonehenge continued into the later 3rd millennium BC, overlapping the period that is supposed to mark the end of megalithic construction. So no, Britain did not simply stop building in stone at 2300 BC. But that does not mean nothing changed. Something did change, and it may be exactly the kind of change that later makes the archaeological record look like a sudden ending. For much of the Neolithic monuments in Britain and Ireland had emphasized collective participation. Long barrows and chambered tombs received the remains of many people. Causewayed enclosures and henges could bring scattered communities together. Stone circles created spaces large enough for gatherings, processions, feasting, exchange, seasonal ceremonies and rituals we can only partly imagine. These were monuments built around relationships between groups, between the living and the dead, between neighbouring communities, between people and a landscape made meaningful by generations of return. But by the later 3rd millennium BC, many of those older traditions were changing. Passage tombs in Ireland, for example, did not all suddenly vanish from people's lives. Great sites such as those at Brúnaboinn remained powerful presences in the landscape. Older tombs could be revisited, reused, disturbed, entered, or incorporated into new stories. In some places, new deposits were placed near ancient monuments. In others, tombs seem to have been closed off or used less intensively than before. That difference matters. A monument can stop receiving bodies without being forgotten. A tomb can cease to be a functioning burial place and still remain an ancestral landmark. People may avoid it because it is sacred, dangerous, politically claimed, or associated with a past they no longer fully understand. Archaeologists can often identify new construction. They can sometimes identify new burials, but it is much harder to detect memory, taboo, oral tradition, or a family walking past an ancient mound and telling children who built it. The same is true of henges and stone circles. Some ceremonial gathering places seem to have declined in use. The huge communal events that had once drawn people together may have become less frequent. Deposits of animal bone, pottery, and other materials changed. Certain enclosures were no longer maintained in the same way. But circles continue to matter, and in some areas stone settings were built or altered into the early Bronze Age. The monumental landscape was not erased. Its social meaning was being renegotiated. Then came the beaker phenomenon. Around the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, distinctive bell-shaped pottery vessels began appearing in Britain and Ireland. So did new burial practices, new forms of metalwork, stone wrist guards associated with archery, copper daggers, gold ornaments, and objects that could signal rank, skill, distant connections, or personal identity. For a long time, archaeologists argued over what this meant. Was it a migration, a trading network, a fashion, a new religion? The answer now appears to be complicated and different in different places. Ancient DNA has shown that Britain experienced a major population change during the Beaker period. People with ancestry ultimately linked to continental Europe arrived, and over time contributed a very large share of the ancestry of later Bronze Age populations in Britain. That does not mean every individual carrying a beaker pot was an immigrant. Nor does it mean the newcomers arrived as one invading army. Migration can happen through many movements over generations: families, marriage networks, pastoral groups, traders, migrants seeking land, and communities joining one another. Ireland also saw substantial change, although its local history was not identical to Britain's. New ancestries, technologies, and burial customs appeared there too. Copper and then bronze became increasingly important. Ireland possessed rich metal resources, especially copper, and would become deeply involved in wider networks of extraction, production, and exchange. The social message of burial began changing as well. Instead of placing selected bones from many people into a shared ancestral chamber, communities increasingly buried some individuals in single graves. A person might be laid with a beaker vessel, an archer's wrist guard, a dagger, stone tools, ornaments, or other carefully chosen objects. Not everyone received such treatment. That is important. A richly furnished grave does not prove a whole society had become rigidly unequal overnight. But it does suggest a shift in emphasis. The old tomb said, "We belong to the ancestors." The new grave could say, "This person mattered," maybe because of lineage, maybe because of wealth, skill, age, gender, connections, or ritual role, maybe because they controlled cattle, metal, land, or access to trade routes. We cannot read the exact message, but individual display was becoming more visible in death. And that change had consequences for monuments. If communities were increasingly organized around households, lineages, mobile herding groups, emerging elites, or control of metals, then the older communal tomb and giant gathering enclosure may no longer have carried the same political force. Why invest generations of labour in a shared ancestral chamber if status is now being expressed through an individual's grave goods, a family's burial mound, a metal object, or a network of distant exchange? This was not the death of monument building. It was a change in what monuments were for. Early Bronze Age Britain and Ireland still produced barrows, cairns, stone settings, burial mounds, and ceremonial sites. In some regions, round barrows multiplied across ridges and downlands. These were highly visible structures. They were not modest. They marked people, places, and claims on the landscape, just as surely as older tombs had done. But the grammar had changed. Earlier monuments often gathered the dead together. Later monuments could isolate individuals beneath separate mounds. Earlier ceremonial centres may have drawn large communities into shared events. Later burial landscapes could emphasise family lines, prestigious persons, and local territories. So when we ask whether the stones fell silent in Britain and Ireland, the answer is not yes or no. Some older communal traditions did weaken. Some passage tombs and henges were used differently or less often. Some great places of assembly lost their former role. But Stonehenge was still being transformed. New stone monuments and burial monuments continued to appear. Metal, migration, and changing identities were reshaping the social world. The silence, if there was one, was not the sound of all construction ending. It was the fading of one ancient conversation while another began. And nowhere is that clearer than in Iberia, because if you want a landscape full of ancient stone tombs, Iberia has almost too much evidence. Portugal, Spain, and southern France contain thousands of dolmens, passage graves, gallery graves, stone circles, menhirs, tholoi, ditched enclosures, hilltop settlements, and burial places built across many centuries. Some are small chambers beneath low mounds, others are vast, carefully engineered structures. Some held the remains of a few people, others received bones from generations. At first glance, the pattern can look dramatic. Many of the great collective tomb traditions reach their height during the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. Then, somewhere around 2300 BC, the archaeological landscape begins to look different. But different is not the same as dead. Take southern Iberia, where one of the most remarkable Copper Age settlements in Europe stood near the modern town of Almeria. It is called Los Millares. By around 3200 BC, people there had built a large settlement with walls, towers, ditches, and a series of smaller fortified outposts spread across the surrounding landscape. This was not a peaceful farming village with one symbolic boundary around it. It looks like a community deeply concerned with controlling access, protecting resources, and watching the approaches. Outside the settlement lay extensive cemeteries of tholos tombs. A tholos is a circular or oval burial chamber, often built with stone walls and a corbelled roof, reached through a long passage. Imagine entering a narrow stone corridor, leaving daylight behind, then arriving in a rounded chamber where the dead had been placed over time, with pottery, tools, ornaments, and sometimes objects made from copper. These tombs were collective. They linked the living to ancestors. But they also required labour, planning, skilled builders, and access to valuable materials. Not every family could necessarily make the same claim on that kind of monument. And that may be the real story of Iberia in the centuries before and after 2300 BC. This was a world where copper was becoming increasingly important. Copper did not instantly transform every community into a kingdom. Early metal objects were often rare. Stone tools continued to be used. Farming, herding, hunting, and local exchange still mattered enormously. But copper created new possibilities. Ore had to be found. Mines or exposed deposits had to be worked. Metal had to be smelted, shaped, transported, traded, and controlled. That process could create bottlenecks. A community might grow powerful not because it controlled every field, but because it controlled the route through a valley. The source of ore, the specialists who knew how to work metal, or the relationships that brought exotic materials from far away. Ivory from Africa, amber from the north, fine stone, shells from distant coasts, and metal ores could all become part of a social language of prestige. And when prestige becomes important, monuments can change. Instead of everyone investing primarily in one shared ancestral tomb, certain lineages may begin emphasizing their own burial places, their own valuables, their own connections, their own ability to mobilize labor. The dead are still important. Ritual is still important. But the ritual message becomes more complicated. It is no longer only, we belong together. It can also become, we control something others need. You can see this tension across Iberia. In the southwest, enormous ditched enclosures such as Perdigones in Portugal were places of gathering, feasting, burial, exchange and ceremony over long periods. They were not simply forts. Their ditches did not always make military sense. Some were repeatedly dug, filled, cut again, and used in ways that appear deeply ritualized. Then there is Valencina, near Seville, one of the largest Copper Age sites in Iberia. It covered an enormous area and contained pits, working zones, burial structures, and evidence for craft production and long-distance connections. Its famous tombs contained remarkable materials, including ivory and other prestigious goods. These places show complexity on a scale that makes a simple collapse story difficult. Around the late 3rd millennium BC, some large settlements were reduced, reorganized, or abandoned. Los Millares eventually ceased to function in its old form. Some ditched enclosures stopped being maintained. Some collective tomb traditions became less common. In certain regions, populations appear to have shifted toward more defensible locations. Fortified places became more visible. Competition may have intensified over land, herds, metal, and access to trade. But even that picture needs caution. A wall is not automatic proof of war. It can mark identity, control movement, protect stored food, display power, or separate sacred space from ordinary life. And an abandoned settlement does not necessarily mean its people vanished. They may have moved a few miles away. They may have changed from one form of community to another. They may have stopped gathering at a great ceremonial centre because political power had become more local, more mobile, or more focused on households and kin groups. The old monuments did not vanish from memory just because new ones were no longer being built. Across Iberia, older dolmens and passage tombs continued to matter. Some were reopened, some received later burials, some were altered, blocked, disturbed, or incorporated into new ritual landscapes. And in many cases we cannot tell whether a tomb that stopped receiving burials had become forgotten, avoided, revered, or claimed by a particular group. Stone is good at surviving, meaning is not. Southern France tells a similar, though not identical, story. The region contains dense concentrations of dolmens and collective burial chambers, especially across the limestone landscapes of Languedoc, Provence, and the western Mediterranean uplands. Many were built or used through long stretches of the Neolithic and Copper Age. Their dates overlap, their reuse overlaps, and their endings do not line up neatly. By the later 3rd millennium BC, new forms of settlement and burial appear in parts of southern France too. Some communities favoured naturally defensible hilltops or enclosed places. Bell beaker pottery spread through networks reaching from Iberia into France and beyond. Metal objects became more common. Individual graves, sometimes with distinctive vessels or personal equipment, gained greater visibility alongside older collective traditions. But this was not Iberia copied across the border. Mountain valleys, coastal plains, river corridors, and upland plateaus all followed different rhythms. A tomb in one region might still be used when another had already been sealed. A hilltop settlement might grow while a lowland enclosure declined. One community might embrace beaker styles. Another might continue older practices while selectively adopting new objects. That is the problem with saying all megalithic cultures stopped at once. It turns dozens of regional histories into one imaginary event. Iberia and southern France do show transformation around this period. There were changes in settlement, changes in burial, changes in trade, changes in how communities defended themselves, and changes in who could display wealth and status. Some great collective monuments lost their old central role. Some ceremonial centres faded. Some fortified places rose. But the stones did not all fall silent on the same day. The conversation changed. Collective ancestors, copper wealth, defended settlements, distant trade, and increasingly visible social rank were all speaking at once. Now take that same question and place it on a small island in the middle of the Mediterranean. Malta is one of the places that makes the idea of a single megalithic ending feel most convincing, and also one of the places that makes it fall apart, because Malta's temples are extraordinary, not just impressive for their age, extraordinary by almost any standard. Across Malta and the smaller island of Gozo, prehistoric communities built freestanding stone temples centuries before the pyramids of Egypt. These were not simple tombs made from a few upright slabs. They were complex buildings with curved outer walls, carefully shaped entrances, paved floors, interior chambers arranged in cloverleaf patterns, altars, carved decoration, and enormous blocks of limestone. At Gantija on Gozo, some stones weigh more than 20 tons. The name means place of giants because later people struggled to imagine how ordinary humans could have moved them. The temples had to be the work of giants, but they were built by island farmers, people growing crops, raising animals, collecting shellfish, making pottery, maintaining boats, burying their dead, and organising enough labour to quarry, transport, shape, and assemble stone on a scale that seems almost impossible for such a small population. And they kept doing it. Malta's temple tradition began roughly around 3600 BC and continued in changing forms for more than 1,000 years. The earliest temples, including Gantija, were followed by increasingly elaborate structures at places like Egar Kim, Menajdra, and Tarxian. By the later phases, temple architecture had become astonishingly refined. Doorways were carefully cut. Stone surfaces were smoothed. Some chambers contained spirals, animal carvings and reliefs that may have held religious meaning we can no longer recover. This was a distinctive island culture. Malta was not isolated in the absolute sense. People crossed the water. They had connections with Sicily and probably with wider Mediterranean exchange networks. But an island is different from a continent. Its land is limited. Its forests are limited. Its fresh water is limited. Its soils can be fragile. And when a society depends on a small number of fields, grazing grounds, and seasonal resources, there is nowhere to retreat when those resources begin to fail. That makes the end of Malta's temple culture especially dramatic, because around 2500 BC, perhaps somewhat earlier or later depending on the site and the dating model, the temple tradition appears to stop. No more great new temples, no more clear continuation of the architecture that had dominated Maltese ritual life for centuries. The old sanctuaries were not slowly transformed into Bronze Age palaces. They were not replaced by another equally monumental building tradition. Something changed and the temple building world ended. If all you saw were the ruins, you might think Malta had suffered a catastrophe. A drought, a famine, an epidemic, an invasion, social collapse. Some event so severe that an entire island society lost the ability or the desire to build in stone. And every one of those explanations has been proposed in one form or another. Environmental pressure is an obvious possibility. Pollen evidence and soil studies suggest that Malta's prehistoric landscapes were heavily used. Forest clearance, cultivation, grazing and erosion may have placed severe pressure on the land. On a large continent, exhausted soil can sometimes mean moving farther away. On Malta, there is no farther away. You can only intensify farming, change your diet, reduce your population, or leave. Climate may have made those pressures worse. The later 3rd millennium BC was a period of changing environmental conditions across parts of the Mediterranean. Rainfall patterns may have become less reliable. Drier conditions could have reduced harvests, weakened pasture, and made water harder to find. A few bad years can be survived. Repeated bad years can change an entire society. But climate alone does not explain everything. The temples had survived for centuries. Their builders had already lived through seasonal uncertainty, storms, poor harvests, and local hardship. For environmental stress to end the tradition, it may have needed to interact with something else. Population pressure, conflict between groups, failures in leadership, changing beliefs, or disruption to the networks that brought materials and ideas across the sea. Disease is another possibility, and it is one of the most haunting. An island population can be vulnerable to epidemic disease, especially if a new pathogen arrives through contact with outsiders. A disease outbreak does not need to kill everyone to transform a society. It only needs to kill enough farmers, craft specialists, elders, children, ritual leaders, or people of reproductive age to break systems that were already under strain. But here we need to be careful. There is no single mass grave on Malta that proves a plague destroyed the temple builders. There is no ancient written account describing a fever sweeping through the islands. Disease is possible, it is not a solved case. Neither is invasion. For years, dramatic endings in archaeology were often explained by imagining newcomers arriving with weapons, burning settlements, and replacing whoever had been there before. But Malta does not give us a clean story like that. There are signs of changing material culture after the temple period. New pottery traditions appear, burial practices change. The famous Tarxian cemetery phase, beginning after the Great Temple tradition, includes cremation burials and material connections that point toward a different world. That suggests movement, contact, or cultural transformation. But movement is not automatically conquest. New people may have arrived from Sicily or elsewhere in the central Mediterranean. Local people may have adopted new customs through exchange and marriage. A reduced population may have reorganized around different beliefs. The old temples may have become associated with ancestors, dangerous powers, failed elites, or a religious system that no longer made sense in a changing world. And then there is the date. This is where Malta becomes so important to the larger mystery. The Great Temple period seems to end around 2500 BC. That is earlier than the famous 2300 BC date that keeps appearing in discussions of late 3rd millennium disruption. Depending on how individual sites are dated, there can be overlap around the edges. Chronologies always have ranges, not laser-sharp endings. But Malta does not fit comfortably into a story where every megalithic culture stops building at exactly the same moment. Its monumental tradition was already ending, or had ended, before some of the transformations we have been tracing elsewhere became most visible. That does not make Malta irrelevant. It makes Malta a warning. When we stand before a ruined temple, we naturally want one enormous explanation. The stones are huge, the silence is huge, the ending feels like it should have been caused by something equally huge. But archaeology rarely gives us one clean ending. Maybe Malta faced ecological pressure on a confined island. Maybe changing climate made that pressure unbearable. Maybe disease arrived through maritime contact. Maybe migrants brought new burial rites and new social structures. Maybe the temple system depended on a kind of collective labour and religious authority that gradually lost its power. Or maybe several of those things happened together. Malta's temples remain one of prehistory's great mysteries, but they are not necessarily evidence for one Mediterranean-wide collapse. They may be evidence for something more complicated, a society with its own island timeline, its own vulnerabilities, and its own transformation. And once we leave Malta, that becomes even clearer, because the Mediterranean was full of stone monuments, trading communities, farming villages, emerging metal networks, and powerful ritual traditions. But it was not one world moving to one clock. And once you see that, the idea of one shared Mediterranean shutdown starts to look even harder to defend. Because beyond Malta, the islands and coasts of the Mediterranean were full of monuments. But they were not building the same kinds of monuments for the same reasons on the same schedule. Sardinia is the clearest example. For thousands of years, Sardinian communities created tombs cut directly into rock, now known as Domus de Janus, houses of the fairies. These were not giant freestanding temples like Malta's. They were underground chambers, sometimes carved to imitate houses, with doorways, beams, ceilings, and interior details, all reproduced in stone. The dead were placed inside spaces that may have been imagined as homes for ancestors. At the same time, parts of Sardinia also had stone circles, standing stones, dolmens, and large collective tombs. Monument building was deeply embedded in the island's social and religious life. But around and after 2300 BC, Sardinia does not simply go silent. Its earlier traditions changed, some burial customs shifted. New pottery styles appeared, metal use became more important. Contacts with the Italian mainland, Iberia, and the wider Western Mediterranean continued to reshape local society. Then much later, beginning around the early 2nd millennium BC, Sardinia produced one of the most dramatic stone-building traditions anywhere in prehistoric Europe. The nuraghi. These were massive stone towers, often built from huge blocks without mortar, sometimes surrounded by additional towers, walls, courtyards, and entire settlements. Thousands would eventually be constructed across the island. Now, the first nuraghi do not appear immediately in 2300 BC. Their main fluorescence belongs to later centuries. And that gap matters. It means Sardinia did not move neatly from one monument tradition to another, as if somebody flipped a switch. Earlier forms changed, new social structures emerged, and eventually a completely different architecture of power, defense, ritual, storage, or community identity took shape. The builders never lost the ability to organize stone. They changed what stone was for, crossed the narrow waters to Corsica, and the pattern changes again. Corsica is famous for its statue menhirs, standing stones carved with human features, weapons, armour, and sometimes faces. Some appear to represent warriors, others may have been ancestors, territorial markers, ritual figures, or all of these at once. Their chronology is still debated in detail, but many belong broadly to the late Neolithic and Bronze Age transition. Some traditions seem to continue or be reworked as metal weapons, and new social identities became more visible. That is not cultural stillness, it is transformation. A stone that once marked a grave, a territory, or an ancestral presence could become something else in a world where copper, then bronze, connected status to weapons, exchange and control over resources. And Corsica was never just a lonely mountain in the sea. It sat on routes linking Sardinia, Tuscany, Liguria, southern France and beyond. Boats carried more than goods. They carried marriage partners, rumours, skills, religious ideas and sometimes people escaping trouble somewhere else. That connection could spread change, but it could also make every place more different, because a community on Corsica did not receive outside influences in the same way as a farming village in Sardinia, a coastal settlement in Sicily, or a burial community in the Balearics. Each group selected what to adopt. Each fitted new materials and new customs into older local traditions, or rejected them completely. Sicily makes this even clearer. Here, the late 3rd millennium and early 2nd millennium BC saw the rise of early Bronze Age cultures often grouped under names like Castelluccio. Settlements, pottery styles, and burial traditions changed. Rock-cut tombs became important in many areas. Some tomb entrances were sealed with large stone slabs. In later periods, the island developed increasingly substantial fortified sites and complex regional societies. Again, not a single silence, not a final disappearance of monumentality, a change in the form it took. And then there are the Balearic Islands, far to the west. The Balearics had their own megalithic traditions, including dolmens and collective tombs. But their most famous monumental architecture came later. Navitas, long stone-built funerary structures shaped almost like overturned boats, belong mainly to the 2nd millennium BC. Later still came the talayots, huge towers and enclosures that transformed parts of Majorca and Minorca. So if somebody claims that Mediterranean island societies stopped building major stone monuments around 2300 BC, the Balearics create a serious problem. In some places, monumental building had not even reached its most recognizable form yet. The monuments arrived later, under different conditions with different social meanings. And mainland Europe shows the same uneven rhythm. Along the coasts of southern France, Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula, older tomb traditions, standing stones, fortified settlements, and new Metal Age burial practices overlapped in complicated ways. One region might stop using collective tombs while another began building new ones. A tradition could disappear from the archaeological record not because the people vanished, but because they started burying their dead differently, using wood instead of stone, cremating bodies, or building in places that have not survived. Stone creates a strange illusion. What survives looks important because it survives. A collapsed wall, a tomb chamber, a standing stone, these can remain visible for 5,000 years. But the houses, boats, shrines, fences, meeting places, textiles and political relationships that gave those stones meaning usually disappear. So when the stone record changes, we are tempted to say civilization changed all at once. Sometimes it did, but sometimes we are only watching one durable tradition end, while other parts of society continue in materials archaeology cannot easily see. The Mediterranean was connected by water. Obsidian from islands moved across long distances. Copper circulated, pottery styles travelled. Seafaring communities knew coastlines, currents, harbours, and seasonal routes that linked places we now put in separate national histories. But connection is not uniformity. A maritime network is not a world empire. There was no central authority deciding what every island should build. No single religion ordering every community to abandon its ancestral monuments. No evidence for one event that reached from Malta to Sardinia, Corsica, Sicily, the Balearics, and every mainland coast, producing the exact same cultural result at the exact same time. What we see instead is a Mediterranean full of local clocks. Malta's temples ended early. Sardinia's older tomb traditions changed before new tower-building societies emerged centuries later. Corsican standing stones were caught up in their own transformations. Sicily developed new burial forms and early Bronze Age communities. The Balearics would create some of their greatest stone monuments after the supposed moment of shutdown. That does not mean nothing important happened around 2300 BC. It means the question has to become more precise. Not, did the Mediterranean stop building? But which communities changed, what traditions ended, what new forms replaced them, and why did the same connected sea produce so many different answers? And if the Mediterranean had no single clock, Egypt has an even more important lesson, because Egypt did not stop building in stone around 2300 BC. In some ways, it was still doing the thing we now associate with ancient Egypt more than any other, building pyramids. But Egypt's pyramids were not like the stone circles, passage tombs, temples and collective graves of Atlantic Europe. They were not projects raised over generations by scattered communities honouring local ancestors. A pyramid was a statement from one of the most centralised states on earth. It said the king was not just a ruler, he was the point where the human world and the divine order met. His death was not a private family event. It was a national crisis that had to be managed through ritual, labour, food production, administration and architecture on a scale almost nobody else could imagine. To build a pyramid, you needed surveyors, quarry crews, boatmen, stonecutters, rope makers, scribes, farmers supplying grain, officials organising labour, and a government capable of feeding thousands of workers while they were away from their fields. This was stone backed by bureaucracy. The great pyramids at Giza, the monuments of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaura were already centuries old by 2300 BC. Their age of truly gigantic construction belonged mainly to Egypt's 4th dynasty, roughly the 26th century BC. But pyramid building continued after them. The 5th and 6th dynasty kings built pyramids too, mostly at places like Saqqara and Abusir. These later pyramids were generally smaller, often built with less durable cores, and many are badly ruined today. But ruined does not mean unimportant. Their surrounding complexes included temples, causeways, storage areas, administrative buildings and royal cult centres designed to operate for generations after the king died. And during the late Old Kingdom, something else appears inside some of these pyramids. Texts, the pyramid texts, first found in the pyramid of King Unas around the late 5th dynasty, were spells and ritual utterances carved into the inner chambers. They were meant to protect the dead king, help him rise into the sky, join the gods, and overcome the dangers of the afterlife. So Egypt was not experiencing a simple loss of religious confidence or a sudden abandonment of monumentality. It was refining its royal religion. It was changing the message written into stone. But there was pressure building beneath the surface. For centuries, Egypt's kings had governed through a system of provinces known as nomes, managed by powerful officials called nomarchs. At first, these officials were appointed by the crown. Over time, some positions became hereditary. Local families accumulated land, wealth, tombs, followers, and influence. The farther you were from the royal court, the more that mattered. A king in Memphis could issue commands, but somebody still had to collect grain in Upper Egypt, manage irrigation, settle disputes, organise labour, and keep the river traffic moving. When local officials became powerful enough, they did not necessarily overthrow the king. They could simply become harder to control, and this may be where environmental stress entered the story. Egyptian civilization depended on the Nile's annual flood. Not too high, because extreme floods could destroy settlements and fields. Not too low, because low water meant less silt, less irrigation, smaller harvests, and hunger. A series of poor inundations could become a political disaster very quickly. If grain stores ran low, local administrators had to decide who ate. If taxes could not be collected, royal projects became harder to fund. If the central government could no longer protect communities from scarcity, powerful provincial families had every reason to take more authority for themselves. Some scholars have linked the end of the Old Kingdom to a period of drying climate around 2200 BC, sometimes associated with the wider 4.2 kiloyear event. There is evidence from different parts of northeast Africa and the eastern Mediterranean for changing rainfall patterns and environmental stress. But the Egyptian case is not as simple as drought happened, pyramids stopped, civilization collapsed. The Nile is fed by rainfall far to the south, especially in the Ethiopian highlands and Central Africa. Reconstructing exactly what happened to individual floods 4,000 years ago is difficult. Written sources from the period are limited. Later Egyptian texts describe famine and disorder, but they were written after the crisis and may exaggerate chaos for political or literary reasons. So the honest answer is that low Nile floods may have contributed to the breakdown. They may have made existing weaknesses worse, but they were probably not the only cause. And before we go further, if you like exploring mysteries where the evidence is more complicated than the headlines, the channel's book on 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website. The link is in the description now. By the end of the 6th dynasty, around the late 23rd or early 22nd century BC, depending on the chronology used, royal authority was weakening. Pepi II, traditionally remembered as an exceptionally long reigning king, may have ruled for decades. Whether he ruled as long as later king lists claim is debated, but a long reign could create its own problems. Officials aged, succession became uncertain, and provincial power continued to grow. Eventually, Egypt entered what historians call the First Intermediate Period. The country did not vanish. People still farmed. Towns still existed. Temples still functioned. Local rulers still commissioned tombs, wrote inscriptions, fought rivals, made alliances, and claimed legitimacy. Egypt was fragmented, not erased. That distinction matters. The giant royal pyramid complex was a product of an unusually strong centralized state. When that state weakened, the old model became harder to sustain. You could not casually redirect enormous surpluses of grain, labour, stone and administration into a king's eternal monument when regional elites were keeping more resources close to home. So royal building changed. Tombs of provincial officials became more elaborate. Local centres gained importance. Mortuary beliefs that had once focused intensely on the king gradually became accessible to a wider elite. The sacred knowledge carved into royal pyramids would eventually appear in coffins belonging to non-royal people. The afterlife was, in a sense, becoming less exclusive. And that is very different from saying Egyptians forgot how to build, lost their religion, or collectively decided that stone monuments no longer mattered. They changed who monuments were for. Compare that with Atlantic Europe. There, a passage tomb or stone circle may have involved many households, local lineages, seasonal gatherings, and shared ancestral traditions. There was no pharaoh commanding labour through a nationwide bureaucracy. No single capital collecting taxes from a river valley and turning them into a mountain of limestone. So, if a local megalithic tradition changed in Britain, Ireland, Iberia or Malta, the causes might include shifts in burial customs, kinship systems, land use, trade, belief or local political authority. In Egypt, the fate of major monuments was tied much more directly to the fate of the state. That makes Egypt a warning against the neat version of this mystery. Around the broader period, when some European megalithic traditions were changing, Egypt did not fall silent. Its central system came under strain. Its pyramid age evolved, its political order fractured. but Egyptian society continued, adapted, and eventually reunited under new dynasties. Not one synchronized ending, another local clock. Mesopotamia gives us a different version of the same warning. Here, around the late 3rd millennium BC, we are not looking at stone circles going quiet, or royal pyramid building becoming harder to sustain. We are looking at one of the world's first great territorial empires coming apart. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now Iraq and parts of Syria, cities had been growing, competing, trading, and fighting for centuries. Hur, Uruk, Kish, Lagash, Umma, Nippur. These were not primitive villages waiting for civilization to arrive. They had temples, palaces, scribes, canal systems, workshops, tax collectors, armies, and long-distance trade routes reaching toward Anatolia, Iran, the Persian Gulf, and the Mediterranean. Then, sometime around the 24th century BC, a ruler named Sargon built something new, the Akkadian Empire. Sargon came from Akkad, a city whose exact location remains unknown. Imagine that. One of the most important capitals of the ancient world has still not been securely found, but its kings left enough inscriptions, monuments, and administrative traces to show what they were trying to do. They were trying to turn a landscape of rival city-states into an empire. Sargon and his successors conquered southern Mesopotamian cities, pushed north into the fertile plains of Upper Mesopotamia, campaigned towards Syria and Anatolia, and claimed influence across an enormous area. Their empire was held together through garrisons, appointed governors, tribute, grain, labour, roads, messengers, diplomacy, and violence. This was not a loose network of communities sharing ideas. This was power concentrated at a scale the region had rarely seen before. And like Egypt, that scale made Akkad impressive. It also made it vulnerable. An empire has to move food, it has to reward soldiers. It has to pay officials, it has to suppress rebellions before they spread. It has to make sure the people at the centre receive grain, silver, livestock, timber and labour from places far beyond the capital. When harvests are good and trade routes are functioning, that system can look unstoppable. When pressure arrives, every connection becomes another point where something can break. By the reign of Naram-Sin, Sargon's powerful grandson, the empire was already facing serious resistance. Naram-Sin's inscriptions boast of crushing a major revolt involving multiple cities and regions. Of course, royal inscriptions are propaganda. Kings do not carve monuments saying, "Everything is under control," except it clearly isn't. But propaganda still tells us what rulers feared. Naram-Sin wanted everyone to know that he had defeated enemies, punished rebels, and restored order. That suggests order had become difficult to maintain. Later traditions blamed the empire's fall on divine anger. One famous Mesopotamian text, the Curse of Agade, claimed that Naram-Sin offended the god Enlil by attacking the sacred city of Nippur. The gods supposedly withdrew their favour, sent destruction across the land, and allowed barbarian invaders called the Gutians to overrun the kingdom. It is a dramatic story. It is also not a neutral historical report. Ancient people often explained political disaster through morality. If the empire fell, somebody must have angered the gods. But modern historians have to ask harder questions. Were there invasions? Almost certainly there was conflict involving highland groups and neighbouring powers. Were rebellions important? Yes. Was warfare already draining the system? Very likely. But then there is the climate evidence. Around roughly 2200 BC, give or take depending on the dating method and the region being studied, several environmental records point toward increased aridity across parts of the Near East. Lake sediments, cave deposits, pollen evidence, dust records, and archaeological changes have all been used to argue for a period of reduced rainfall and severe drying. In northern Mesopotamia and Syria, this mattered enormously. Southern Mesopotamia depended heavily on irrigation from the great rivers, but much of the Akkadian Empire's northern zone relied more directly on rainfall agriculture. Fields there could produce large grain surpluses in favourable years. Those surpluses helped feed cities, support armies, and connect the north to the imperial economy. If rainfall failed repeatedly, the consequences would not stay local. Harvests fall, villages are abandoned or shrink, people move toward rivers, wells, cities, or more reliable farmland. Tax and tribute become harder to collect. Armies become more expensive to maintain. Local governors have fewer reasons to obey distant officials. Border regions become unstable. Rivals see opportunities. Drought does not need to destroy an empire by itself. It only needs to make everything else harder. One of the most discussed sites is Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria, ancient Shinar. Archaeologists found evidence that the settlement's urban occupation ended or was sharply disrupted around the period of Akkad's decline. Some layers contain wind-blown dust and signs consistent with a drier environment. The site became central to the argument that climate change helped trigger a wider collapse. But even here, caution matters. An abandoned city is not a climate gauge. It may reflect warfare, migration, changing trade routes, political decisions, disease, local soil exhaustion, or a combination of pressures. And not every settlement in Mesopotamia followed the same path. Some places contracted, some survived, some may even have benefited as people and resources were redirected. So the Akkadian collapse was probably not one event on one day caused by one drought. It was fragmentation. After Naram-Sin, later rulers faced further instability. The empire's final decades appear to have been marked by shrinking control, contested territories, and declining central authority. By around the 22nd century BC, Akkadian imperial power had ended. The political map broke apart. Regional dynasties emerged. In time, new powers, especially the rulers of in southern Mesopotamia, would build another great state. Mesopotamia did not die, it reorganized, and that is exactly why this region is so central to arguments about the so-called 4.2 kiloyear event. The Akkadian collapse seems to occur near a period when evidence for drying appears across a wide zone, from parts of the eastern Mediterranean and Egypt into Syria, Mesopotamia, Iran, and beyond. That overlap is tempting, maybe too tempting. A collapsing empire gives the climate story a human face. Drought becomes not just a line in a cave record, but abandoned fields, hungry households, angry cities, unpaid soldiers, and a king discovering that his commands no longer reach the edge of his world. But Mesopotamia does not prove that one global catastrophe made every society collapse at once. It shows something more useful. Environmental stress can magnify political weakness. It can turn ordinary rivalry into rebellion, make distant provinces harder to control, and expose the hidden cost of running a complex society. And when we turn east toward the Indus region, that distinction becomes even more important. Because there too, cities changed, but not on exactly the same schedule and not in exactly the same way. The Indus region is where the idea of a single worldwide collapse around 2300 BC starts running into a serious problem. Because around 2300 BC, the cities of the Indus civilization were not falling silent. They were in the middle of one of the most remarkable urban experiments on Earth. Across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, communities had been growing for centuries along the Indus River system and its surrounding plains. By roughly 2600 BC, this process had produced what archaeologists call the mature Harappan phase, and the scale of it is difficult to overstate. This was not one capital ruling a simple kingdom. It was a vast cultural zone stretching from the mountains of Afghanistan to the Arabian Sea, from the plains of Punjab into Gujarat and the edge of the Thar Desert. Its best-known cities include Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Dholavira, Ganariwala and Rakhigarhi. Some covered hundreds of hectares. Together they formed one of the three great urban worlds of the Bronze Age, alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia. But they did things differently. Egypt built around divine kings, temples, tombs and monuments that shouted the names of pharaohs across thousands of years. Mesopotamia left royal inscriptions, conquest lists, law codes and temples rising over city centres. The Indus cities are quieter. They had no clearly identified palaces, no obvious royal tombs packed with gold, no giant statues of conquering rulers. Their writing system remains undeciphered, so we cannot read their histories in their own words. We do not know the names of their kings if they had kings in the way Egypt and Akkad did. What we do see is organisation. Cities were carefully planned. Streets often ran in orderly grids. Bricks were made to standardised proportions across enormous distances. Houses commonly had wells, drains, bathing areas, and access to sophisticated systems for moving wastewater away from crowded neighbourhoods. Mohenjo-Daro had hundreds, perhaps thousands of wells. Dholavira developed massive reservoirs and water management systems in a harsh seasonal landscape. Think about what that requires. Not just skilled builders, not just enough labour to lay bricks. It requires rules, shared measurements, training, supply chains, people cutting timber, making bricks, digging wells, maintaining drains, moving food, producing tools, organising workshops, and somehow getting thousands of people to follow similar systems across a territory larger than many ancient states. The Harappans were also extraordinary craftspeople. They made finely drilled carnelian beads, shell ornaments, copper and bronze tools, faience objects, stoneware bangles, painted pottery, and small carved seals marked with animals and short inscriptions. Their seal imagery includes bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, and creatures that may be mythical. These objects travelled far beyond the Indus world. Mesopotamian texts refer to a distant place called Meluha. Most scholars identify Meluha with the Indus region. Ships and merchants moved goods through the Persian Gulf. Indus seals and artefacts have been found in Mesopotamia and Gulf settlements. In return, the Indus world received materials it did not have in abundance, including metals and perhaps luxury goods, from far beyond its borders. So, if the claim is that all complex societies, all monument-building cultures, all connected worlds stopped around 2300 BC, this is the moment to stop and look carefully. Around that date, Indus urbanism was still functioning. Its great cities had already emerged. Its trade networks were active. Its craft systems were producing goods on a huge scale. Its standardized weights, bricks, seals, and streets suggest a civilization that was not in its final death spiral, but operating with remarkable coordination. That does not mean nothing was changing. No civilization stands still for centuries. River channels shift, flood patterns change, trade partners rise and fall. Political arrangements evolve, and the Indus region depended on a delicate relationship between seasonal monsoon rains, river flooding, groundwater, and agricultural cycles. But the major transformation visible in the archaeological record unfolded later. After roughly 1900 BC, the mature Harappan urban system began to change dramatically. Large cities lost population or were abandoned. Standardized systems became less widespread. Long-distance exchange appears to have weakened. The distinctive Indus script, at least in its familiar urban form, largely disappears from the record. Crafts that had once been organised at urban scale became more localised. For a civilization famous for big cities, this looks like decline. But decline can hide what actually happened. The people did not vanish. There is no evidence that the entire population of the Indus region simply died, fled, or was erased by one catastrophe. Instead, settlement patterns shifted. Communities became smaller and more dispersed. Population appears to have moved toward areas where rainfall, rivers, or local farming conditions were more dependable. In some regions, settlements continued. In others, new regional cultures emerged from Harappan traditions mixed with local changes. The civilization did not disappear like a light switched off. It decentralized, and that difference matters. A city can shrink while the people who built it survive. A trade network can weaken while farmers continue planting crops. A writing system can stop appearing on seals without every memory, skill, or social tradition being lost. Archaeology is especially good at noticing the end of standardized urban systems. It is less good at recognizing continuity when that continuity happens in villages, seasonal camps, smaller towns, and homes built from mud brick or wood instead of monumental stone. Why did this transformation happen? There is no single answer everyone accepts. Changing river systems may have played a role. Some settlements in the wider Indus sphere were connected to rivers that later shifted course, became less reliable, or no longer carried the same seasonal flows. The history of the Gagahakra river system is especially debated. For years, dramatic claims connected it directly to a lost mighty river described in later texts. But the actual geological story is complicated, and different stretches of the system changed at different times. Monsoon variability may also have mattered. Climate records suggest that rainfall patterns across South Asia changed over the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BC. A weakening or less predictable monsoon would not necessarily create instant desert. But it could reduce harvest reliability, change flood cycles, strain water supplies, and make concentrated urban populations harder to support. Then there was trade. The Indus cities were connected to the Gulf and Mesopotamia. When political systems and commercial routes changed in Western Asia, distant exchange may have become less profitable or less dependable. A civilization built partly on moving specialized goods across long distances has options when those routes weaken. But those options may involve becoming more local, more rural, and less centralized. None of this requires a single apocalypse. It requires pressure arriving through multiple channels at once. Less predictable water, shifting rivers, changing markets, growing difficulty maintaining large cities, communities making practical decisions generation after generation about where to live and how to survive. And once again, the dates matter. A strict 2300 BC cutoff does not fit very well here. The mature Harappan world continued for centuries after that date. Its most visible urban transformation belongs mainly after about 1900 BC, though the timing varied from region to region and some changes began earlier or continued later. That is a gap of roughly 400 years. In archaeological terms, 400 years is not a rounding error. It is the distance between grandparents and descendants, separated by more than a dozen generations. It is enough time for trade routes to be remade, rivers to shift, political systems to reorganize, and whole populations to adjust their way of life, without knowing they are participating in what future archaeologists will call a collapse. So the Indus region does not destroy the climate argument. It complicates it. Maybe changing environmental conditions affected societies across a huge area. Maybe monsoon instability and aridity placed pressure on urban systems from Mesopotamia to South Asia. But pressure did not produce identical outcomes on identical schedules. Akkad fragmented around the late 3rd millennium BC. Indus urbanism remained strong through much of that period, then transformed later. Egypt continued through crisis and reorganization. And across Europe, the supposed ending of megalithic building turns out to depend on which monuments, which regions, and which dates we choose to count. The more places we examine, the less this looks like one synchronized moment when civilization stopped, and the more it looks like something messier, a world of different societies, connected in some ways, separate in others, each keeping time by its own rivers, its own rainfall, its own politics, and its own decisions. And then there is the land between them, Anatolia, the Levant, the islands and coastlines of the eastern Mediterranean. This was not one civilization, it was a crossroads. To the south lay Egypt, to the east Mesopotamia, to the north the mountains and plateaus of Anatolia. Between them ran caravan tracks, river valleys, sea lanes, copper routes, timber routes, and the narrow corridors through which armies, herders, traders, refugees, and ideas could move. If any region should reveal a single connected collapse around 2300 BC, this might be it. And it does show disruption. But once again, disruption is not the same thing as one event, one date, or one cause. Start in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. During the early Bronze Age, parts of Anatolia were filled with fortified settlements. Communities built walls around hilltop towns, controlled passes through the mountains, worked copper and bronze, and traded objects across enormous distances. The region was divided into local polities, not yet the giant territorial empires that would emerge later. But some centres were wealthy, organised, and heavily defended. At places like Troy on the northwest coast of Anatolia, archaeologists found successive settlements built one on top of another. Troy was not a single city frozen in time. It was a stack of cities, each with its own walls, houses, workshops, disasters, and rebuilding. One of these phases, known as Troy II, ended in destruction sometime around the middle or later 3rd millennium BC. For a long time, dramatic burnt layers encouraged simple stories. Invaders, war, total collapse, but burned cities do not explain themselves. Fire can come from attack, accidents, internal conflict, earthquakes, or deliberate clearing before rebuilding. And after Troy II ended, people did not abandon the site forever. New communities continued living there. The settlement changed. Its architecture changed. Its connections may have changed. But Troy remained part of the landscape. That pattern appears again and again. Some Anatolian towns were abandoned, some shrank, some were destroyed and rebuilt. Some expanded or became more important as older routes shifted. Across western and central Anatolia, archaeologists see major changes around the end of the 3rd millennium BC. Settlement systems were reorganized. Certain long-standing local traditions faded. New forms of pottery, metalwork, and political organization began appearing. But it was not silence, it was transformation. And Anatolia's geography helps explain why. This is a land of high plateaus, fertile valleys, rugged mountains, and sharply different climate zones. A drought that devastated one marginal farming district might affect another region less severely. A trade route blocked in the south could make a northern route more valuable. Political collapse in one town could create an opportunity for its neighbour. Now move south into the Levant. The early Bronze Age Levant had its own urban world. Across modern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, people lived in walled towns, farmed grain and olives, raised sheep and goats, made pottery, and participated in exchange networks stretching toward Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean coast. Some of these towns were substantial. They had fortifications, storage areas, public buildings, and dense neighbourhoods of mud brick houses. Their walls tell us something important. This was not a peaceful world waiting for a climate event to arrive. Competition was already built into the landscape. Towns fought over farmland, water, grazing territory, trade routes, and access to labour. Local rulers had to feed populations, defend walls, manage alliances, and hold together political systems that may have been fragile even in good years. Then, during the later 3rd millennium BC, many southern Levantine cities changed dramatically. A number of fortified urban sites were abandoned or reduced in size. Monumental city life became less visible in the archaeological record. In some areas, the following period is represented by smaller villages, open settlements, burial grounds, and seasonal camps, rather than heavily fortified towns. At first glance, this looks exactly like collapse. Cities gone, walls abandoned, urban administration dissolved. But look closer, and the picture changes. The population did not necessarily vanish. Many people may have adopted more mobile ways of life, moving seasonally with herds of sheep and goats between grazing zones. Others lived in smaller farming communities that left fewer durable remains than big walled towns. A mud brick city with public buildings is easy for archaeologists to find. A scattered network of herding camps and small villages is much easier to miss. So perhaps some communities were not destroyed. Perhaps they were reorganized. Pastoral mobility becomes especially important here. When rainfall becomes less reliable, or when political insecurity makes city life dangerous. Raising herds and moving between seasonal pastures can be a survival strategy. It is not automatically evidence of failure. It can be an adaptation, one that makes sense in a landscape where fixed urban centres have become expensive to defend and difficult to supply. But adaptation can still be painful. Leaving a city means abandoning investments made over generations. Walls, houses, fields, storage systems, sacred places. Family tombs, a shift from urban life to smaller, more mobile communities may reflect resilience. It may also reflect a world where the old system could no longer hold. Further north, the story is different again. In Syria and the northern Levant, some major centres suffered destruction or decline around the period associated with Akkad's crisis. Ebla, one of the great palace cities of 3rd millennium Syria, was destroyed around 2300 BC, though the precise circumstances remain debated. Its archives preserve evidence of a complex kingdom dealing in textiles, metals, timber, livestock, diplomacy, and long-distance trade. But Ebla's destruction did not mean Syria ceased to exist. Other cities persisted, some regions continued to support dense settlement, and over the following centuries new political formations emerged. The landscape of power changed, but it did not become empty. This is where comparison with Mesopotamia becomes useful. Mesopotamia had the Akkadian Empire, a vast political structure that could fragment spectacularly because so much authority had been concentrated in royal centres, armies, taxation systems, and long-distance supply networks. When that system came under pressure, whether from drought, war, rebellion, economic strain, or all of them together, its collapse left unusually dramatic traces. Egypt faced crises too, but Egypt retained the Nile, its deep administrative traditions, and a political identity that outlived individual dynasties. Power fragmented? Yes. Monument building changed, but Egyptian civilization continued. The Levant and Anatolia were different from both. They were mosaics of smaller kingdoms, towns, villages, herding communities, and trading ports. Their political fragmentation may have made them vulnerable in some ways, but it may also have prevented one failure from becoming everybody's failure. Trade mattered enormously. Anatolia supplied metals, timber and stone. The Levant linked inland caravan routes to Mediterranean ports. Cyprus was becoming increasingly important for copper. Goods moved through this world in stages: metals, textiles, pottery, oils, wine, precious stones, crafted objects, and probably people themselves. When trade routes shifted, the effects would not have been equal. A town built around a caravan corridor could decline if that corridor became unsafe. A coastal settlement might prosper if seaborne exchange became more valuable. A ruler who depended on taxing merchants could lose power quickly. A herding group with flexible seasonal routes might survive better than a city dependent on stored grain and imported materials. And warfare was always waiting in the background. Fortifications multiply in some places. Destruction layers appear in others. Weapons, walls, and settlement locations suggest that communities were making decisions with defense in mind. Climate stress, if it existed, did not operate in a vacuum. Less reliable harvests can intensify conflict. Disrupted trade can weaken rulers. Political fragmentation can make travel dangerous. War can then destroy fields, block routes, and push more people into migration. That is not one cause. That is a chain reaction. So does Anatolia and the Levant support the idea that something significant was happening around 2300 BC. Yes, in many places, absolutely. Urban systems changed. Some settlements were abandoned. Palaces burned. Trade patterns shifted. Pastoral populations may have become more important. Old political arrangements weakened, while new ones began forming. But the region does not prove a single universal catastrophe. The dates vary, the outcomes vary. Some cities disappear, others endure. Some communities become less urban, others become newly connected. And the evidence itself is uneven. A destroyed palace leaves a dramatic archaeological signature. A surviving village, a migrating herding group, or a rerouted trade network can be much harder to see. What we are looking at is not an Eastern Mediterranean switch being flipped off in 2300 BC. It is a crowded world under pressure, a world where climate may have mattered, where war clearly mattered, where mobility, trade, local geography and political choices mattered too. And that brings us closer to the real question. If distant societies were connected by trade, migration and shared environmental pressures, how connected did they need to be for crisis in one region to echo through another? One possible answer has become almost impossible to avoid. Climate, more specifically, what paleoclimate researchers call the 4.2 kiloyear event. The name sounds technical because it is technical. It means a period of unusual climate instability, centered roughly 4,200 years before present. In calendar dates that places it somewhere around 2200 BC, give or take, depending on the record, the region, and the dating method being used, which is immediately interesting, because 2200 BC sits uncomfortably close to the date that keeps appearing in our story. The weakening of Akkad, changes in Levantine cities, shifts in Egyptian political life, transformations in trade, settlement abandonment in some regions, and, at least at first glance, the apparent slowing or ending of several older monument building traditions. So was there a giant drought? Did the climate change suddenly enough to shake societies from Atlantic Europe to the Indus Valley? Maybe. But the real answer is more complicated and much more interesting. Nobody has a weather report from 2300 BC. There are no thermometers, no rainfall gauges, no satellite images. Instead, scientists reconstruct ancient climate from natural archives. The planet keeps records. You just have to know where to look. Caves are one of the most important sources. As water drips through rock, It leaves tiny layers of mineral on stalagmites and stalactites. Those layers can preserve chemical signals connected to rainfall patterns, temperature, and the source of moisture. Like tree rings made of stone, they can sometimes be dated with remarkable precision. Then there are lake sediments. Year after year, mud, pollen, charcoal dust, and microscopic organisms settle onto lake bottoms. A wetter period may leave one kind of layer, a dry period another. Pollen can show whether forests retreated, grasses expanded, or farming landscapes changed. Marine cores tell another part of the story. Scientists drill into the seafloor and pull up long cylinders of sediment containing dust blown from deserts, shells from tiny ocean organisms, and chemical clues about sea temperatures and rainfall far inland. River systems leave evidence too: flood deposits, ancient channels, changes in water flow. In Egypt, the Nile mattered more than almost anything. In Mesopotamia, the behaviour of the Tigris and Euphrates shaped farming, transport, taxation, and imperial power. In regions dependent on seasonal rains, the failure of a monsoon could matter just as much as the failure of a river. And when researchers compare these records, they often see signs of a major climatic disturbance around the late 3rd millennium BC. In parts of the Middle East, conditions may have become drier. Some records suggest weaker rainfall, more frequent drought, and increased dust. In the Indian Ocean system, monsoon patterns appear to have shifted. In parts of the Mediterranean and Europe, the picture may include cooler conditions, changing storm tracks, or less predictable seasonal rainfall, rather than one simple continent-wide drought. That last part matters. The 4.2 kiloyear event was not a single cloudless summer that covered half the planet. It was probably a period of instability expressed differently in different places. One region may have faced years of failed harvests. Another may have received rain at the wrong time of year. A third may have experienced colder winters, destructive floods, or changing river behaviour. For farmers, timing can be as important as total rainfall. Rain that arrives after planting fails to help. A river that floods too little can bring famine. A river that floods too much can destroy fields and settlements. And even the date is less exact than it sounds. 4,200 years ago is a useful label, not a stopwatch reading. A cave record in Oman may show drying beginning earlier than a lake record in Italy. A pollen sequence in Iberia may show change later. Radiocarbon dates come with ranges. Archaeological phases can last generations. One society may have been hit hard around 2300 BC. Another may not have felt the greatest effects until centuries later. So climate can explain pressure. It can explain why marginal farmland became harder to use, why cities dependent on grain surpluses struggled to feed workers and armies, why herding communities moved more often, why rulers lost legitimacy when irrigation systems, harvests, or trade routes failed, why competition over water, pasture, and stored food could turn violent. But climate alone cannot explain everything. Drought does not automatically burn a palace. It does not choose which dynasty collapses, which town rebuilds, which trade route survives, or which community adapts by becoming more mobile. Those outcomes depended on politics, geography, technology, social organization, and luck. Climate may have loaded the gun, but human decisions, existing rivalries, fragile institutions, and changing networks determined where it was fired. And if climate created a broad zone of stress rather than one universal disaster, then the next question becomes crucial. How did pressure travel between societies that were not one civilization but were still connected by the movement of metal, food, people, and ideas? The answer is trade. Not trade in the modern sense. No customs offices, no shipping insurance, no merchant fleets crossing the Mediterranean on fixed schedules. But by the late 3rd millennium BC, distant communities were connected by material networks that could stretch astonishing distances. Copper moved, tin moved, obsidian, amber shells, rare stones, decorated ceramics, fine weapons, gold ornaments and other prestige goods moved too. And every object that moved carried something else with it. Information, status, obligations, alliances, new styles, new technologies, sometimes probably the expectations that kept powerful people powerful. Take copper. Copper ore was not evenly distributed. Some regions had rich deposits, others did not. Yet copper tools, weapons and ornaments appear far from the mines where the metal originated. In Atlantic Europe, in Iberia, in the Alps, across the Mediterranean, communities were increasingly tied into systems that brought raw materials from one place and finished goods to another. Then there was tin, the ingredient that transformed copper into bronze. Tin is much rarer. Its sources were limited, often distant from the places where bronze was being made and used. That meant bronze was never just a local technology. Even if a village cast its own axe or dagger, part of the supply chain may have begun hundreds of miles away, passed from group to group through a chain of exchanges that nobody controlled from end to end. Obsidian tells a similar story. This volcanic glass can often be traced to specific geological sources. A blade found in one settlement might come from an island, a mountain, or a volcanic region far beyond the local horizon. In the Mediterranean, obsidian from places such as Sardinia, Lipari and Melos travelled widely in earlier periods and continued to show how maritime connections could link communities separated by water. Amber moved south from northern Europe. Shells moved inland from coasts. Exotic stones became beads and pendants. Ceramics carried recognizable styles between regions. A prestige object could be traded, gifted, inherited, exchanged in marriage, or taken as loot. Its path was rarely simple. That is the crucial point. A piece of amber found far from the Baltic does not mean a Baltic trader personally arrived at that settlement. It may have changed hands 20 times. A coastal group exchanges it with a river community. That community passes it to herders. The herders bring it to another valley. Over generations, the object or the style travels far beyond any individual person's journey. This was connection without central control. Europe and the Mediterranean were not one world civilization. They did not share a single government, a single religion, a common language, or a coordinated plan for building monuments. The people raising stone tombs in Atlantic Europe were not receiving orders from pyramid builders in Egypt. The communities of Iberia, Malta, Mesopotamia, and the Indus region were not chapters of one hidden empire. But they did not live in isolation either. They occupied overlapping worlds of exchange. A mining district could depend on food from farming communities. Metal workers could depend on distant ore, charcoal, labour and patrons willing to commission expensive objects. Coastal settlements could gain influence by controlling landing places, river mouths, or access to shells, salt, fish and imported goods. Inland elites could build status by obtaining things nobody else could get. And this is where climate pressure becomes more than a local problem. If drought reduced harvests in one region, a community might have less surplus to exchange. If changing rainfall made rivers harder to navigate, transport became slower and more dangerous. If pasture failed, mobile herding groups might shift their routes, entering territories already claimed by others. If seafaring became riskier, or if coastal populations were forced to move, maritime links could weaken. None of this required a total collapse. A route did not have to disappear completely to matter. It only had to become less reliable. Imagine an elite whose authority depends on organizing labor, hosting feasts, rewarding followers, arranging marriages, and distributing rare objects. For generations, that system works because metal arrives, food surpluses exist, and distant contacts bring prestige goods that prove the elite has influence. Then conditions change. The harvest becomes uncertain. Copper is harder to obtain. Tin arrives less often. Traders or exchange partners stop appearing. Communities that once accepted obligations demand food for themselves. Suddenly the ruler, chief, lineage or ritual centre has fewer rewards to offer and fewer workers to call upon. A massive stone monument is not just stone, it is food for labourers, time away from fields, skilled organisers, social peace. A reason for many households to cooperate on a project whose benefit may be symbolic rather than immediate. When resources tighten, monument building can become harder to justify. That does not mean people abandon their beliefs. They may simply express them differently. Smaller tombs, different burial customs, portable metal objects instead of permanent stone structures. Local shrines instead of labour-intensive ceremonial complexes. So shared economic vulnerability could create a pattern that looks coordinated from a distance. Networks spread opportunity. They also spread risk. If several societies relied, directly or indirectly, on the same fragile web of metals, food, transport routes, and elite exchange, disruption could produce similar changes across a wide area. Not because everyone received the same command, not because a single catastrophe struck on the same day, but because many communities had become connected enough to feel pressure travelling through the system. And that raises another possibility. What if the apparent silence of the stones was not only about climate or trade routes, but about the people moving through the gaps they left behind? People moving through the gaps. That may be one of the most important parts of the story. When archaeologists talk about migration in the 3rd millennium BC, they do not necessarily mean vast armies sweeping across continents, wiping out everyone in their path. Sometimes migration is much quieter than that. A few families moving into a new valley, herding groups following seasonal pasture, marriage partners arriving from distant regions, metal workers carrying specialized knowledge from one community to another. Small movements repeated over generations can transform an entire cultural landscape. And around 2300 BC, or in the centuries on either side of it, the evidence for movement becomes harder to ignore in parts of Europe. Burials begin to change. For much of the Neolithic, death was often collective. People were placed in chambered tombs, passage graves, dolmens, and other monuments, built to hold many generations. The dead were not always treated as separate individuals in the modern sense. Bones might be moved, sorted, gathered, and placed with those of ancestors. A tomb could represent a lineage, a community, a claim to a landscape. It said, "We belong here. Our ancestors are here. This land has a history, and we are part of it." That is what a megalithic tomb could do. It was not simply a grave. It was a social machine made of stone. Every burial connected the living to the people who came before. Every return to the monument reinforced shared identity. The dead belonged to the group, and the group belonged to the dead. But in some regions, that emphasis began to shift. Instead of collective tombs, archaeologists increasingly find individual burials. One person, one grave, sometimes placed beneath a mound, sometimes accompanied by carefully chosen objects, a pottery vessel, a copper dagger, an archer's wrist guard, a stone battle axe, gold ornaments, beads made from materials that had travelled enormous distances. The famous bell beaker phenomenon is part of this picture. Though it is not one simple people, one simple culture, or one simple migration, Bell beaker pottery appears across a huge area of Europe, from Iberia to Britain and beyond. In some places, genetic evidence indicates substantial movement of people. In others, local communities may have adopted new styles, practices, or status symbols without being replaced wholesale. That distinction matters. Objects can travel without people. Ideas can travel without either, and people can move without leaving a neat archaeological label behind. But when new burial customs, new material styles, and evidence of changing ancestry appear together, it suggests something more than fashion. It suggests that social worlds were being reorganized. Think about the difference between entering an ancient communal tomb and being buried alone with a copper dagger. The first burial says your identity is rooted in a lineage stretching back through generations. The second may say something different. It may emphasize a person's rank, their alliances, their skill, their wealth, or the special role they held while alive, not necessarily individualism in the modern sense. These were still deeply social communities, but status could now be displayed through the body of a particular person and through objects that could be owned, exchanged, inherited, or taken away. Metal was perfect for this. Stone monuments were permanent, public, and collective. They stood in the landscape for centuries, but a copper axe could be carried. A bronze dagger could be displayed at a feast. Gold could be worn on the body. A rare object could move through marriage alliances, tribute, gift exchange, inheritance, or conflict. Metal turned prestige into something portable. And because metal was difficult to obtain, difficult to produce, and often dependent on distant contacts, it could become a powerful marker of influence. Not everyone needed to understand metallurgy. They only needed to understand that a shining axe, a finely made dagger, or a gold ornament came from a world of connections most people could not access. That changes how power works. A community that once demonstrated unity by raising a tomb for its ancestors might increasingly demonstrate status through control of metals, livestock, trade routes, and followers. The people best positioned to benefit may not have been the old ritual authorities tied to ancient monuments. They may have been mobile herders, warriors, traders, miners, metalworkers, or families able to build alliances across long distances. And if power moves, belief can move with it. This does not mean people suddenly stopped caring about the old stones. Many megalithic monuments remained visible, meaningful, and sometimes actively used long after their main building phases ended. Later communities revisited them, buried people near them, altered them, reused them, and told stories about them. A monument can stop being built without becoming forgotten. But its role can change. The old tomb may no longer be the centre of community life. It may become an ancestral landmark, a sacred place from a deeper past, a boundary marker, or a monument associated with people whose world was no longer the same as the living. That is a very different thing from abandonment, and it may explain the strange silence better than a single catastrophe. If populations were moving, if burial customs were changing, if metal was creating new forms of prestige, and if authority was becoming more personal and more mobile, then giant collective stone projects may simply have lost their old social purpose. Why gather hundreds of people to build for the ancestors when your status depends on what you can carry, exchange, command, and display? Why add another chamber to an old collective tomb when the new ritual focuses on a single burial, a weapon, a drinking vessel, and a network of alliances extending beyond the horizon? The stones did not have to fail. The people changed around them. But before we turn that change into a worldwide mystery, we need to confront a problem. The problem is the evidence itself. Archaeology does not give us a perfect calendar of the ancient world. It gives us fragments. Charcoal from a fire, a bone from a burial, grain from a storage pit, a piece of timber from a roof. pottery from a layer of soil. And from those fragments, archaeologists try to reconstruct events that unfolded across centuries, sometimes across thousands of miles. That is an extraordinary achievement. But it also means that apparent synchrony can be created by the way we measure the past. Take radiocarbon dating. It is one of the most powerful tools archaeologists have. Organic material contains radioactive carbon while it is alive. Once a tree is cut down, an animal dies, or a person is buried, that carbon begins to decay at a predictable rate. Measure what remains, compare it to the known rate of decay, and you get an estimate of age. But estimate is the important word. A radiocarbon date is not usually a single year. It is a range, and once that date is calibrated against fluctuations in ancient atmospheric carbon, the range can widen. A sample might point broadly to a period between 2400 and 2200 BC. Another site, hundreds or thousands of miles away, might produce a range between 2350 and 2150 BC. Those ranges overlap, and when they overlap, it is tempting to say both places changed at the same time. Maybe they did, but maybe one changed a century before the other. Maybe one was already declining while the other was still flourishing. At this distance, two separate processes can blur into one apparent event. It is like looking at lights going out across a vast horizon during a storm. From far away they seem to vanish together, but one house may have gone dark at dusk, another at midnight, another days later. The darkness is real. The timing is the question. Then there is something archaeologists call the old wood effect. Imagine a community burns timber in a ritual fire, or uses an old beam in a burial structure. That wood may have come from the heartwood of a tree already hundreds of years old when it was cut. Or it may have been salvaged from an older building. Radiocarbon dating measures when the tree stopped growing, not necessarily when people used the wood. So a charcoal sample found in a monument might appear to date the monument to 2500 BC, even if the fire was lit much later using ancient timber. That does not make radiocarbon dating unreliable. It means every date has to be interpreted in context. What exactly was dated? Was it a short-lived seed, which might closely date a single season? Was it a human bone, which may date a burial but not the construction of the tomb? Was it oak charcoal from an unknown part of a long-lived tree? The answer can change the story completely, and construction is only one part of that story. When we say a megalithic monument ended, what do we mean? The last stone was placed, the last chamber was added, the last repair was made, the final burial took place. The last ritual visitor left an offering, the moment local people stopped telling stories about it. These are not the same date. A tomb might be built around 3500 BC, expanded in 3000 BC, receive burials for centuries, then be revisited long after its original community had changed beyond recognition. A stone circle might stop receiving new stones, but remain an important gathering place. A monument can be architecturally finished while its social life continues for 1,000 years. So the end of monument building may really be the end of one building tradition. Not the end of ritual, not the end of a population. Not even the end of the monument's importance. Then comes sampling bias. We know the names of Stonehenge, Newgrange, Agar, Kim, Karnak, the pyramids, the great tombs of Iberia. These places are famous because they survived, because they are spectacular, and because generations of researchers have studied them. They have more dates, more excavation reports, more attention, more arguments. But famous sites can distort the picture. A giant monument is not automatically typical. It may have been unusual even in its own time. Meanwhile, thousands of smaller sites are poorly excavated, badly preserved, buried beneath modern towns, destroyed by farming or never recognised at all. A local stone setting may leave almost no trace. A timber shrine may rot away completely. A community that's shifted from monumental building to smaller household rituals may become nearly invisible to us. Absence of evidence is especially dangerous here. How do you prove that people stopped building? You can show that no newly dated monuments have been found after a certain period. But that may mean construction truly declined, or it may mean later monuments were made from earth, wood, and other materials that did not survive. It may mean they were dismantled. It may mean no one has excavated the right valley yet. The archaeological record is not a census. It is a survival record. And survival is unfair. Stone survives better than wood. Tombs survive better than houses. Elite graves survive better than ordinary lives. Dry regions preserve materials that humid regions destroy. Countries with long archaeological traditions often have far denser records than regions affected by modern development, conflict, or limited funding. So when someone says megalithic cultures all stopped around 2300 BC, the first question should be, all according to which evidence? Which regions, which kinds of monuments? How many securely dated sites? Are we dating construction directly or later use? Do the date ranges genuinely cluster within a narrow window, or do they merely overlap across several centuries? Are we seeing a sudden stop, a gradual decline, or a shift into forms that archaeology struggles to detect? That is the framework we need. First, separate local sequences from global claims. A real crisis in one region does not become worldwide just because another region changed at roughly the same time. Second, distinguish a date from a process. Societies do not usually transform on one morning in one year. Building traditions can fade unevenly, village by village, generation by generation. Third, look for independent evidence. If climate records, settlement patterns, diet, migration, trade disruption, burial change, and construction decline all point toward a similar period in the same place, the case becomes stronger. If only one line of evidence points there, caution is essential. And finally, treat silence honestly. A gap in the record can be meaningful, but it can also be a gap in excavation, preservation, or dating. Around 2300 BC, there may well have been real pressures affecting many societies. Drought in some regions, changing trade routes, migration, conflict, new forms of hierarchy, old monuments losing their social purpose. But archaeology can make separate endings look like one great synchronized collapse. The stones are silent, our dating methods are not. But they speak in ranges, fragments, and probabilities. So what may actually have happened around 2300 BC? Not one catastrophe. Not one command passed through some lost global civilization telling builders from Britain to Mesopotamia to put down their tools. Not a single night when every sacred landscape went silent. But something real may have been happening. Across parts of the ancient world, the late 3rd millennium BC was a period of pressure. In some places, climate became less predictable. In others, trade systems shifted. Political centres became fragile. Old religious traditions lost influence. Populations moved. New technologies changed who held power. Communities that had spent generations building in stone began investing their labour somewhere else. The pattern is not imaginary. The mistake is assuming that a pattern automatically has one cause. In Mesopotamia, there is strong evidence for serious stress around the end of the Akkadian Empire. Drier conditions may have reduced agricultural production across already vulnerable farming zones. Cities depended on grain, labour, taxation, transport, and political control. When harvests failed or became unreliable, the whole system could begin to crack. A kingdom built on moving food from productive fields to urban centres is powerful in good years. In bad years, it can become dangerously brittle. Egypt faced disruption too, though not a simple disappearance. The Old Kingdom weakened during a period associated with Lower Nile floods, regional power struggles, and the breakdown of centralized authority. Pyramid building did not suddenly vanish because Egyptians forgot how to stack stone. The state that could mobilize enormous labor forces and concentrate resources at royal centers was changing. Monumental construction was tied to political organization. Change the political organization, and the monuments change with it. That is an important distinction. A decline in huge building projects does not necessarily mean cultural collapse. It may mean the people paying for those projects no longer had the same power, the same labor force, or the same reason to demonstrate authority in stone. In the Indus region, the timeline works differently again. Major urban transformation came later, unfolding over centuries after 2300 BC. There were environmental changes, changing river systems, shifting trade networks, and eventually a movement away from the great cities towards smaller settlements. But trying to force that long process into a single 2300 BC collapse does violence to the evidence. The Indus cities did not simply switch off with the Akkadian Empire, and in the eastern Mediterranean, Anatolia, and the Levant, there were local destructions, new settlement patterns, changing trade connections, and political reorganization. But these regions did not move in perfect lockstep either. Some communities contracted, others adapted, others grew. History was uneven because people were unevenly exposed to risk. Then there is Atlantic Europe here. The story is less about the collapse of city-states, because there were no Akkadian-style empires to fall. It is about a transformation in how communities organized identity, burial, power, and memory. Some older megalithic traditions did decline. The great communal tombs and passage graves that had defined earlier Neolithic landscapes were no longer being built with the same intensity in many areas. Certain stone monuments stopped expanding. Some ceremonial centres lost their earlier role. That much is real. But stone building did not simply end. Stonehenge continued to be altered and used after 2300 BC. In parts of Britain and Ireland, monuments remained active places even as burial customs changed. In Iberia and southern France, people continued building tombs, walls, and monumental structures, though often in changing forms and social contexts. Elsewhere, new forms of monumentality emerged. Fortified settlements, elite burials, metal-rich graves, new ceremonial spaces, new claims to territory. The stones did not all fall silent. The conversation around them changed. And that change may have been driven partly by the arrival and spread of new networks. Metal mattered. Copper first, then bronze. Created new opportunities for trade, craft specialization, and social inequality. Long-distance exchange connected regions that had never belonged to one political world. Amber, metals, exotic stone, prestige goods, livestock, and marriage alliances moved across astonishing distances. These connections could spread ideas without spreading orders. A drought in northern Mesopotamia did not need to cause a burial change in Britain. But both regions could be responding to a broader world in which resources, trade routes, and social status were becoming more unstable. A community facing uncertain harvests might abandon a labor-intensive ritual project. Another might build a fortification. Another might invest in elite graves. Another might keep using its old monuments while changing the meaning of the ceremonies held there. Same century. Different decisions, and climate may have intensified these differences. The 4.2 kiloyear event appears in records from several regions as a period of climatic disruption, especially aridity, around this broad window. But climate does not act like a universal reset button. Drought affects irrigated kingdoms differently from rain-fed farmers, an island community differently from a river civilization, a society with grain stores, trade partners, and flexible institutions differently from one already strained by inequality or conflict. Climate creates pressure. Politics, geography, technology, and culture determine what breaks. So the strongest explanation is not a synchronized global shutdown. It is a world of indirect connections and shared vulnerabilities. Many societies were entering a period when old systems became harder to sustain. Some centralized states fractured, some trade networks reorganized, some populations migrated, some religious traditions changed. Some monumental projects declined because the communities behind them had changed their priorities, from far away that can look like one great ending. But closer up, it looks more like dozens of different stories unfolding under partly similar conditions. That is still remarkable. It is still worth questioning. A broad cluster of transformations around the late 3rd millennium BC deserves attention. But a striking pattern is not yet a demonstrated global explanation. To prove one, we would need evidence of a common mechanism operating across regions, securely matched dates, direct links, shared material changes, and a causal chain stronger than coincidence. We do not have that. What we have is more complicated, and probably more human. That is where the real mystery begins. Not the mystery of a vanished world civilization. Not a secret order that reached from the temples of Malta to the stone circles of Britain, from the pyramids of Egypt to the cities of Mesopotamia, and somehow told everyone to stop building at the same time. The deeper mystery is simpler and more difficult. How many connections between ancient societies have disappeared without leaving clear evidence behind? Because the original claim has power for a reason. When you line up the dates, something does seem strange. Across a broad stretch of the Old World, the late 3rd millennium BC was a time when old systems changed. Monument traditions shifted. Some great building programs slowed. Political centers weakened. Trade routes were reorganized. Communities began expressing power, belief, and identity in new ways. That is not nothing, but saying that all megalithic cultures stopped building at once goes far beyond what the evidence can support. Malta is the clearest warning. Its extraordinary temple-building tradition appears to have ended centuries before 2300 BC. By the time societies in other regions were facing late 3rd millennium pressures, Malta's great temple age was already in the past. The island may have experienced environmental strain, population decline, disease, conflict, or some combination of factors. We still don't know, but it was not part of a single neatly synchronized ending. Atlantic Europe gives us a different story. In Britain, Ireland, Iberia, and parts of France, older Neolithic monument traditions were changing. Some communal tombs were no longer built with the same intensity. Some ceremonial landscapes stopped expanding. Some old centres may have lost their earlier importance. But the people did not abandon stone. Stonehenge remained active. Burial mounds appeared. Individual graves became more important in some regions. Fortified places, walls, and settlements took on new significance. The question was no longer just, how do we build a monument for the ancestors? It was increasingly who controls land, metal, livestock, trade, and status. That is not silence. That is a change in the conversation. Egypt tells another version of the story. The age of the great Old Kingdom pyramids came under pressure as central authority weakened. Lower Nile floods may have reduced agricultural reliability. Provincial leaders gained power. The state became less able to command labour and resources on the old scale. But Egypt did not disappear. Egyptians continued farming, worshipping, governing, burying their dead, and rebuilding political life. Monumental architecture changed because the state behind it changed. In Mesopotamia, the collapse of the Akkadian Empire looks dramatic, and it probably was dramatic for the people living through it. Drought may have made existing problems worse. Cities and imperial administrations depended on fragile systems of food, labour, transport, and taxation. When those systems failed, the results could be catastrophic. Yet Mesopotamian civilization did not end either. Cities survived. New powers emerged, old networks broke apart, then new networks formed. The Indus region refuses to fit the simple story almost completely. Its great urban transformation came later and unfolded over a long period. Cities such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa did not suddenly go dark in 2300 BC because of the same event affecting Akkad or Egypt. Environmental change, shifting rivers, changing trade patterns, and social reorganization all likely played a role. But this was a process measured in centuries, not a single synchronized collapse. And across the wider Mediterranean, the picture is just as uneven. Some places saw contraction, some saw new settlement forms, some maintained old traditions while adapting to new conditions. Islands, coasts, river valleys, mountain communities, and inland farming societies did not experience risk in the same way. A dry period could be devastating in one region and manageable in another. A disrupted trade route could ruin one elite system while opening opportunities for someone else. That is the pattern worth holding on to. Around 2300 BC, and across the centuries around it, many societies may have been dealing with broad stresses: climate instability, changing exchange networks, migration, competition over resources, new metal technologies, political fragmentation, shifting religious beliefs. The old ways of organizing labor and authority may have become harder to maintain. But broad pressure does not produce identical outcomes. One society builds fewer temples, another builds walls, another changes burial customs, another abandons a city, another moves to smaller settlements, another keeps using ancient monuments but gives them a new meaning. Another survives the crisis well enough that, from the outside, it barely looks like a crisis at all. This matters because monuments can mislead us. Stone survives. Wood rots, cloth vanishes, spoken rituals disappear. Temporary shrines leave almost nothing. The archaeological record preserves the biggest and hardest parts of ancient life, then tempts us to believe those were the only things that mattered. When stone building declines, it can look like a civilization has gone quiet, but maybe it has simply started speaking in materials that do not survive. Maybe authority moved from communal tombs to households. Maybe memory moved from public temples to family rituals. Maybe wealth became portable: metal tools, ornaments, animals, weapons, imported goods. Maybe people stopped gathering to build monuments because the society capable of organizing thousands of workers no longer existed. Or maybe they chose not to because new beliefs made the old forms less meaningful. The monuments did not simply vanish. Societies changed what they built, who built it, and why. And that leaves us with a final possibility. Ancient people may have been more connected than we can currently prove. Not connected by a single empire or a lost global civilization, but by chains of exchange, migration, marriage, imitation, shared technologies, and stories passed from one community to another. A copper object can travel hundreds of miles. So can an idea. So can a ritual. So can fear of a changing climate, or knowledge that a distant trade route has failed. Most of those connections are now invisible, so the claim is wrong if it promises one solved mystery. But it is useful if it makes us look again. Why did so many old systems transform within this broad period? Which changes were local? Which were connected? And how much of the ancient world remains hidden simply because the evidence has not survived? Those questions are far more interesting than a neat answer. If you enjoyed this journey into the strange silence in stone, please like the video, comment where you are listening from, and subscribe for more ancient mysteries examined with the evidence in mind. And if you want to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify through the link in the description.